All right, this go around, we'll be looking at Americans are wrong about the War of Independence from Britain. Here's why. Now, this is from the channel, not mistaken yet, Girl Gone London. Check her channel out. She's got a lot of good videos. Now, she did a video not too long ago about American reactions to her stuff, and she had some interesting things to say that were, how do I put this? Not very flattering for some of them at all, especially the fact that so many don't take and tie back in. Every video I've ever done, you can always find the video. Unless it's a TV show I'm reacting to, you can always find it right in the description, the original video. So, that being said, y'all take and go show her channel some love. She's an American that's actually living in England. So, her perspectives are going to be a little bit different than others that we might see. Like, we've watched stuff from like Lost in the Pond, Evan Edinger. I'm interested to hear what her perspective is on this. Let's take a look at it, shall we?
America becoming independent was more like if you got dumped by a high-maintenance girlfriend who cost you too much money. Whereas Americans think that we truly are the ones that got away. Revolution, or rebellion. The original fight between Britain and America is a fascinating subject, not just in what actually happened, but in how it's depicted on both sides of the pond. In this video, we're debunking some of the myths that Americans believe about how the US came free from Britain, including why Britain cares way less than Americans think it does, and also why enlistees to the Revolutionary Army were required to have at least 2 good teeth. To Americans, the American Revolutionary War, as we call it in the US, is legendary. It's a huge part of the history of our country, obviously. And to be honest, I'd argue that most of us are more likely to know facts and figures about this particular period in American history than we would about more world-changing wars.
Okay, so on that note, I think that's more the case if you're in your 30s and going into your 40s. If you're in your 20s and your teens, and even in your early 30s as an American these days, I don't think that's no longer the case. I don't believe. I know when I was going through school, it was a lot heavier focus every year throughout history, unless you looked at world history, and even then, it still got like 2 chapters. So a lot of us folks that are, there's a lot of folks that are probably about 33, 34 to on up that probably know a lot more about the war for independence against Great Britain than people that are probably 30, 29, 28, 25 and below. But I know definitely when I was growing up and people in my age range and a couple years younger, that's definitely the case. That and the American Civil War, and most take an interest as well in World War One and World War Two. So 4 wars that you're going to take, and most folks in that age range are going to know more facts about or have forgotten more facts about than what kids these days and people up to about the early 30s probably know.
But across the pond, the American War for Independence, as it's most often called in the UK, is not much. It's a blip on the radar, possibly, perhaps briefly mentioned in a child's schooling experience.
Well, after 1,000 years of history, it's just a blip in their history, so
a long list of other revolutions from British colonies, but it's certainly not focused on. And to Americans who are raised, in many ways, to think that this huge, nation-altering moment in our country's history still plays in the minds of Brits today, who must be depressed every July 4th to think about the colonies they lost, we're a little bit surprised to learn that no one really cares. Or rather, Brits don't care at all, if they ever did. Surely someone did at some point in time, the British Crown, or the war wouldn't have happened, but the American memes that make it out to be that this is a sore spot in Britain's history are very mistaken. The reason is simple, really. The British Empire was vast, and American colonies were hardly the most important of them all. The Brits were far more concerned with other battles, and making sure they kept much more lucrative colonies like India around this time. America becoming independent was more like if you got dumped by a high-maintenance girlfriend who...
Yeah, I was about to say, because within the Commonwealth itself, like America as a colony, we provided some wood, cotton, like indigo. Like, we provided some things, but compared to like India with spices and other stuff, yeah, just kind of incomparable.
who cost you too much money. Whereas Americans think that we truly are the ones that got away. And when it comes to teaching the American War of Independence in schools, well, again, it makes much more sense to be a bigger part of Americans' learning. Because it's about us. It's on home soil. It's the founding of a nation. And it really starts much of our history as a country in terms of current governance. This helpfully means that we always get to it at the beginning of a school year when there's more time, as opposed to the end when you seem to run through 1900 to the 2000s in about 2 weeks. British history is so much longer, so much more filled with everything from queens and kings and medieval plots and an incredible amount of stuff. So much stuff. The American colonies are such a microscopic portion of this history, and so it doesn't make it into the British history standard schooling lessons. That's American misconception number 1. Now let's talk about American misconception number 2, which has to do with the support that the Revolution, or rebellion as it was referred to by the British Crown, had within the colonies. We are taught in America about all of the exciting figures who led the charge and what we know in the US as the Patriot. These are your Benjamin Franklins, your Paul Revere riding through town to tell people that the British patrols were coming. And by the way, he never actually shouted, "The British are coming." This is a myth. No. He actually said
And there was more than one writer. It was him and like 2 others, if I'm not mistaken. And one of them, if I'm not mistaken, was actually a female. But the fact of the matter is also is there were just as many Tory or loyalist towns and cities as there were that supported the revolution. It was almost a 50-50 split. It was more loyalists in some places than there were patriots for the people that actually took an interest.
The regulars are coming out, and he was not riding and yelling. He was quietly trying to warn people. Anyway, it's easy as Americans to think that it was all of the colonists versus the British Crown, but that's not the case. About 20% of the population in the colonies were loyalists, which meant that they took the side of the British Crown back.
Oh, I didn't realize it was that low. I'm mistaken. My apologies.
This could be for so many reasons. People with close business connections with Britain, obviously, as well as people who were just conservative by nature when it came to valuing order, and they were concerned that an independent new nation would be chaos. Fast forward to 2024, and honestly, they were probably onto something. And actually, over the course of the war, there was a larger percentage of the population, estimated to be around 20 to 45%, who were in the middle. They were known as the trimmers, and they didn't fall completely on either side. This group often changed their loyalties based on who was winning at the time, which is honestly still how most of Orlando supports its sports teams to this day. Anyway.
She's not, I like the correlation on that. That's actually pretty clever. Yeah, and it's like I said earlier, and I had the loyalist figure 30% off, but still very much there was a lot of folks that very much it was if they took an interest. It's not everybody supported, because the thing that is overlooked in all of this a lot of times is the fact that just the act of rebelling in the way they did. When they signed the Declaration of Independence, they signed their own death warrants is what happened. They could have been hung for treason, hands down. So there is the fact that there was a lot of folks that were just like, whatever, and then tossed their loyalties as the war went. Makes sense, because that's so much that's riding on the line.
The Patriots, the side fighting for American independence, had to really try and coax men into serving in the army and provide them with incentives to do so. Take a look at this poster asking for colonists to join the Patriots in George Washington. They're promised a bounty of $12, a full supply of goods and clothing, a daily allowance, and more.
Unfortunately, a lot of times it took a while to actually receive any of that. Like, it's not something, because the Continental Army struggled. The amount of people who brought their own guns and the amount of contracts with arms manufacturers in this country that were operating at the time to provide workable weapons for war is astounding. I think it was close to like 70%. So only 30% of people who actually brought their own weapons, their own guns, were in working order for war. Like, it'd be great if you want to take and kill a deer, or you want to kill a squirrel, but for killing a British soldier, the accuracy and it being in working order for something of that nature, fixing bayonets, it just wasn't the case. And even the money part, everything like that, a lot of that lagged a lot of times if they were paid, because there were so many desertions and everything else like that, especially during the first winter there in Valley Forge.
Says that you will return home with your pockets full of money and your head covered with laurels, i.e., meaning if you sign up with us,
Glory.
you are going to return having people think that you fought on the right side. The loyalists, or those on the side of the British Crown, also had to recruit, calling these people heroes and promising them 50 acres of land where you can retire when you finish fighting, as well as $5 and the clothing that you'll need. Also, fun fact, potential enlistees were required to have at least 2 good teeth. Not because they were going to be featured in any group photos, but because these teeth were needed to bite off the end of the paper cartridges used in the muskets. Now, another misconception also has to do with the support for the war on the British side, and by that I mean the people back home in Britain rather than in the colonies. Sure, there were plenty who supported the British Crown in the war against the colonies and making sure they tried to keep them obedient. Some very scathing posters were created, including this one by Jay Barrow of the American rattlesnake, presenting the Americans as dangerous traitors who were cunning and deceitful, like a rattlesnake. But there were also plenty in Britain who were concerned about the economic disadvantages of going to war with the colonies, and they wrote to the king urging him to basically give the American colonists the freedom that they wanted. They didn't want to risk this trading relationship. Their hope was that the Americans would stay friendly if the British pulled back and were less hostile, giving in to their demands. And again, many were absolutely on the side of the aristocracy in Britain, referring to American independence as shocking and unpleasant and most unhappy business. But others, like Thomas Townshend, wrote to the Duke of Portland in 1776, saying that the government and majority have drawn us into a war that in our opinions is unjust in its principle and ruinous in its consequences. As he points out, the majority back home in Britain were very much not on the side of the Americans, but the point really is that there were more voices and differing opinions on both sides of the equation than is perhaps depicted in a simplified version of what happened. Some British printmakers, for example, did sympathize with the American cause, and they would depict Americans as an Indian maiden rather than the rattlesnake, which was a much more generous representation. The next misconception has to do with the reasons that America ever tried to declare independence in the first place. Many are familiar with the no taxation without representation line, but at a guess, most people would point to the Boston Tea Party, originally known as the destruction of the tea in 1773, as the main event that
Yeah, you don't mess with the British's tea. They get a little bit upset about that.
spurred on the rebellion or revolution. Colonists were mad about taxes on tea, specifically that the Tea Act allowed the East India Company to sell tea from China and American colonies without paying taxes. And so they destroyed an entire shipment of tea in protest. However, the American Revolution didn't fully start until the Battle of Lexington and Concord in 1775. This was
Shot heard around the world.
and before the Boston Tea Party, if we back up a bit, there were other tax revolts against British royal authority.
Yeah, you had the stamp tax, and I want to think there was one on like the pewter that was used for like making the different, like making spoons and different inlaying different items and stuff. Like there was a few that kind of got people's feathers ruffled. Like this started almost a good 10 years before the War for Independence itself, if I'm not mistaken.
And plenty of rumblings within the colonies of what they felt were unjust. This included the lesser-known Pine Tree Riot in 1772, where colonists protested heavy fines against them for harvesting trees. So essentially it was a tree party rather than a tea party. And the final misconception, and the one that does take even me by surprise based on what they teach in American public school, is that the American Revolution did not end in 1776, which is very confusing because you're like, we celebrate the 4th of July in America because it was July 4th, 1776, when the Declaration of Independence was signed. And this is what most Americans
1783.
Day, which must mean this is when they separated from Britain, right? Genuinely, this is what most Americans think. We declared it, and so it must be so. But that's wrong. The American Revolution didn't end until 1783 when the Treaty of Paris was signed. In fact, France didn't even enter the American Revolution on the side of the colonists until 1778. And the final
I was going to say, I think one of the bigger misconceptions is the fact that the whole thing of, oh, we took and defeated the British. Not without help. If the French wouldn't have joined, and if Spain hadn't lent support as well in different parts, we would have lost. We still would have been British subjects. That's a glaring overlook on so many people's parts. But also what she's talking about with the fact that the Treaty of Paris in 1783 to end the war. 1776 was just, the war had been going on for, like, if I'm not mistaken, 2 years at that point, 2 or 3 years at that point. And it was finally, or I think it's 2 years at that point. It was just, yeah, we're done. We're going to take and make sure who was behind this. Here you go. Because they had, even after the first shots were fired, they had took and sent envoys to the king.
Land battle wasn't until 1781 in Yorktown. This was years after the Declaration had been signed. But in some ways it does make sense why 1776 is the year Americans consider themselves to have gained independence when you look at it like one internet poster put it. Do you consider the end of your relationship to be when you broke up with your ex, or when they stopped calling you? But I suppose the main purpose of this video American friends when they ask you if Brits care about the American War of Independence or whether you cry into your cornflakes every July 4th. As the answer, after 10 years of living in the UK as an American, is definitely they do not. I did know a Brit who once told me they convinced an American that the UK actually skips July 4th on the calendar altogether because it's too sore a subject, which seems far-fetched that somebody would believe that, but sadly is probably true. Now that takes us to the end of this video. I hope you learned something new. As always, thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.
I learned that I had my figures wrong in that one spot. Her take on it, though, and the way she presented it, very, very well done. Again, go check out the channel. Yeah, there's a lot of misconceptions. A lot of misconceptions around the American Revolution or the War for Independence and the way it's viewed by Americans. Which, like I said, more people my age, probably from about 33, 34, 35, up to my age and older, are going to know more facts than what people in even like 20s and probably up to about 30 or so know. Because just the way everything has been taught in school changed by the time I took and got out. It's sad that we don't know, that more folks don't know the history of the U.S. past just certain aspects here and there. Like the biggest thing it seems to be harped on is the slavery portion of it. And it's like, well, we've had other stuff happen too. Just saying. Like, there's other stuff that's happened. Her take on her video, though, I like the way she addressed the myths of what Americans believe instead of taking it just, like we've watched it from what the British think to now, her video just taking and looking at myths that are believed by Americans themselves. And her perspective as somebody who actually lives in England, I'm sure she's heard, she's probably went through the gamut of, what people think or, their feelings on it or how it's overall viewed, and she sees firsthand probably how it's taught. So it's very good presentation of the video, though. Definitely check her channel out. I hope y'all enjoyed this video. Y'all be good to each other. Love yourselves. Peace.